Namaste everyone, and I, Samira Shah, on behalf of Bhavita Foundation, welcome you all for today's session on the Bharat Gatha series that we have been continuing. So today, of course, before we begin, I'd like to wish all of you a very Shubh Swatantrata Divas. So we are as much a part of our history as history is a part of us. A historical narrative is often subjective and therefore prone to possibilities of distortions. When we read history, we are often oblivious of the silent screams, the omitted toils, the perspectives of the oppressed, the invisible tears of the ones defeated, and the presence of the ones lacking the authority to writing their history. And today, for our Bharat Gatha series, we are privileged to have with us Parag ji joining us from Houston, USA, and giving us an insight on the 1857 War of Independence, the untold story of 1857 revolution, which I'm sure will be revealed to us by him. He's being the author of the Operation Red Lotus, which he's going to give us a lot of insight. So also with this, Parag Tope ji comes from the family of the Tatya Tope, who was one of the leaders of the war of the 1857. He is the author of this book that presents the war from an Indian point of view. He decoded the mystery of Red Lotus flowers and the chapatis that were used in the planning of the logistics of the war. The book is available on Amazon, and I'm sure after this, we will all, most of you would have the copies. If not, would like to grab one. So Parag Topeji is an entrepreneur and the founder of Visual Stager, a software for 3D visualization and virtual reality staging. His interests are decapitalizing history and civilization security. So with this, I'm very much happy to have inviting him on behalf of Bhavita Foundation to join us and share with us his insight. So Parag ji, can we please have you start the session now?
Sure. Thank you, Samira. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak at this very important day.
So Bhavita Foundation is a non-for-profit institution based in Mumbai, and we have projects involving social developments, livelihood, and holistic education from initiation to conclusion, which we take up mainly. Our vision is to enable human development empowered by education and responsible harnessing of Earth's resources. We have also have the mission to facilitate elevation of hunger, poverty with the result of imparting value and skill-based education while establishing mechanism of sustainable livelihoods to foster national progress. So in doing so, we have a couple of initiatives where we mainly, make sure that all our vision and the mission of the organization is met. To this, one of our first initiatives is the Hunger Free Nation, under which in these pandemic times of COVID, we have been reaching out to 10,000 families across various, the tribal families, the migrant laborers, and lots of slum areas, which were in the red lines of Mumbai also, providing them with grocery kits and meals. And that's a program that we run around the Hunger Free Nation with different projects like Slum to School, Sankalp, and the project of COVID-19 food relief. The second initiative is School of Sustenance, where Green School program and Plant a Caretaker has been initiated. So recently in this place of Vada, we have been supporting nearly 100 tribal families with mango and bamboo saplings. So we have been creating livelihoods for them by supporting them and creating, giving them these saplings which were planted for the future. Sowing the seeds is one of our core initiatives where Samvardhan, under which Dangi breed cows preservation is being taken care of. And we have in the locality of Murbad, which is very near to Mumbai, and 2-hour drive where we have this initiative where again livelihood is being supported, and Samriddhi, where free inputs are given to farmers. So nearly 500 farmers were educated on the process of organic farming. Rice harvesting, rural experience is given to food sustainability and awareness of natural farming, and cow conventions are also our activities which are taken care under this initiative, Sowing the Seeds. The next, which is Lessons for Life, the fourth initiative, is a project where we have Balwadi, the BMC Balwadi, adopted 5 of them now and looking for more. with the various support of corporates and like-minded people who also volunteer here for education. We have seminars for Dincharya, Kalitu Kusum, Ahar Shastra, and Plan Your Progeny that happens. So these Balwadis are the preschools that we have in the BMCs, which are where we actually train and educate young children. Under our next initiative, Bridge for Artisan, is where we have different rural and urban connect, I would say, is what we built in as a bridge, where we get the urban market a lot of rural products, which are traditionally handcrafted and hand woven by the communities, the artisanal communities of India. So under this, we have Venu, where we provide bamboo artisans from Melghat products. Under Vastra, we have the weaving from Varda. Dhatu, under which we have bell metal from Orissa. Kridakriti, under which we have board games, the Kalamkari traditional board games that we also promote. So all of these are what we promote, reviving the Indian art and craft. At the same time, also connected to the Ayurveda and the healthy lifestyle patterns, which will be supported, for example, through the Kasa utensils that we mainly promote. The last initiative is the India First, under which we have gathered today also, for which we have series like the Bharat Gatha, and where we, have topics revolving around nation building by engaging various communities and professionals by the means of entrepreneurship, heritage promotion, and intellectual positioning of the Indian narrative. So Veer Gatha is also one of our session, and Project Dharohar has been our key project under this India First initiative. And we are very happy that today, being our celebration for the Independence Day, we have with us Parag Topeji, who is going to be doing our presentation ahead. So this was a quick, short brief on introducing all of you in the audience to our organization, Bhavyata Foundation, where we have our 6 initiatives, and we would be very happy to have all of you connected with us on various possibilities. So we have our options of volunteering with us or connecting us through all our social media handles, which I have put up on the screen right now for all of you. And also during the session or after the session, we would be happy to hear from you in terms of your comments or your feedbacks, and also give us your feedbacks on the Google reviews to tell us about your experience with this session. May I now please request Paragji to once again let me know if he can share his screen.
Okay, great. So this talk is about to present a platform that can present the story of India from a present day context. I mean, history, the way it is told in various different ways. For example, most of the history that we have read would focus more on the social aspects, would focus more on the way historians would like to present history more from a humanities point of view rather than a holistic point of view. So here the effort was, when we wrote the book, was to look at it from a complete point of view, from economic point of view, political point of view, as well as logistics point of view. And then our goal here was to not only understand what was lost, but what was won and what remains unfinished even today. And we'll talk about 2 important events, 1857 and also 1946, which is also an untold part of the day we actually got freedom. So we'll be covering both these topics as well. So we'll roughly talk about 1857, maybe about 30-35 minutes. We already finished the presentation by Samiraji about Bhavyata Foundation. We'll speak a few minutes about 1946. We'll look at what makes what could be some of the ways in which we could look at our own history differently. What are the blinders that historians have typically when they look at our past? What remains? What is the unfinished agenda from 1850? The leaders of 1857's goals. What remains and what could be done next? And then we will have a Q&A session. So this was a Tope family project. We started this in actually 2006. So this was 1 year before the 150th anniversary of the War of 1857. And this was my sister's Rupa's idea that that we should work together and put effort in writing this book. all of us worked hard on doing the research. So Rupa and Nandita, my sister-in-law at that time, spent time in the archives. Dhananjay, my brother-in-law, he helped in writing, editing. Dr. Rajesh, who is my brother, he worked with a Shikhast translator. Shikhast is a script in which we found some letters in Urdu. So he helped work with the translator to get them translated. My dad, he helped research maps, as well as he spent a lot of time mapping out Tatya Tope's campaign. And we all come from very varied non-specialist history backgrounds. So, military, medicine, software, teaching, engineering, business. So it was a combination of these varied backgrounds that enabled us to really put almost 3 years of effort until the book was published in 2010. So let's start with the story of Red Lotuses. Why do we call this book Operation Red Lotus? Several months before the war of 1857 began, so May 10th is when you can say the war actually started. Several months before that, there was a very interesting set of events that started playing out. Red lotus flowers began to appear in the garrisons where Indian soldiers, so the British used to call them native infantry soldiers, so where the Indian soldiers were stationed, a runner would come from outside and bring several dozen red lotus flowers, and then give it to the Subedar, who would be the highest an Indian could rise to in the British Indian military. So the structure of the military was they had 71. They had basically at a overall level, you had the Bengal Army. Bengal Army spanned all the way from Kolkata to modern day Peshawar in modern day Pakistan. Then you had the Madras Army, and then you had the Bombay Army. The Bengal Army was the largest army, and it had 71 regiments. Each regiment had about 1,000 soldiers with 10 companies. So each company had 100 soldiers, and each company had 4 platoons, about 25 to 30 soldiers. And the highest an Indian could rise was the level of a Subedar, who would be heading up a platoon. So a runner would come, give a red lotus flower to the Subedars. The Subedars would line up their sepoys, the sipahis, the soldiers, in one line, and he would hand over the red lotus flower to the first sepoy, and then he would pick one petal and hand over the flower to the soldier behind him. He would pick another petal and he would hand it over to the soldier behind him, and then the last person, whatever was remaining, he would go and give it back to the runner, and then everybody would shout, "Sab lal ho jayega." And then this went on from regiment to regiment on different parts of India for several weeks. And then at some point in time, the cry changed from "Sab lal ho jayega" to "Sab lal ho gaya hai." And in this period, no blood was shed, no guns were fired. So this was something which the British observed, and they just dismissed this as strange native ritual. So this is something which a lot of history books talk about. In fact, red lotuses and chapatis have been mentioned about in reference to 1857 all the time. However, nobody has attempted to explain what could be the reason for the mysterious red lotuses doing these strange things. I also mentioned about these Chapati messages. So the Chapati messages were very interesting. Unlike garrisons where the red lotus flowers would appear, what was going on was that a runner would bring sometimes 2, sometimes 4, sometimes 6, sometimes 10 chapatis to a village. He would meet up with the mukhiya or the chowkidar of the village, and the mukhiya would invite villagers, and they would all take a little piece of the roti, eat it, and then they would be asked to make the same number of chapatis, so either 2, 4, or 10, and then the runner would take those chapatis and go to the next village, and the same thing would happen in the next village. They would eat the chapatis, make more chapatis, and the runner would go on. And this was happening across villages and towns all across North India. And again, this was heavily discussed amongst British bureaucrats, British army, and the only explanation was it was some kind of a way to plague off bad omen or something like that. They never really had an explanation. for why these chapatis were doing these rounds. Now, cutting to the chase, the mystery of the red lotuses was that a red lotus flower, interestingly, has about approximately 25 to 30 petals. So if every soldier were to pick a petal, what would remain at the end would be just the stem that was holding the petals together, right? So, and when the soldiers would hand over the stems back to the runner would have a rough count on how many soldiers had actually plucked a petal. So one platoon would be one red lotus flower, right? So 30, 35 would meant a regiment. So this was a numeric count for for how many soldiers were in a way enrolled. So this was a metaphorical enrollment of soldiers. They didn't need to know the details. They simply knew that they were doing something bigger, and a few Subedars knew the details of the plan. So why was this numeric count important? If you look at logistics, especially when wars were fought in the 1800s, it was a very, I mean, even today logistics is complicated, but because of technology, logistics in the 1800s was very different. Every soldier would have 3 to 5 camp followers who would accompany the soldier. So, for example, if you had one regiment of 1,000 soldiers, you had roughly 20,000 people who would be traveling along with that regiment, because they would include the people who would be cooking, who would be supporting the soldiers. There were also thousands of horses, camels, elephants, mules, and bullocks. The elephants would drag the cannons, the bullock carts would transport the soldiers. Camels could also be used in certain parts of India. Camels were used for transporting. The mules would be doing the heavy lifting for transportation as well. So it included traveling medicines, wines, quills, beds, pots, pans, horse clothing. All this was being transported. Weaponry, tents for officers. In this logistics, there's one thing missing. What's missing in this list is food. Napoleon had once said that an army marches on its stomachs. That means provisioning for food was critical in managing the movement of the troops. And now, in the first 3 months of the war, Indian soldiers marched over 1,000,000 man miles. 1,000,000 man miles. This was during a period where the average, on an average, armies marched about 8 to 10 miles a day. So when you're talking about thousands and thousands of soldiers marching millions, 1,000,000 man miles, somebody had to arrange for the foods, right? So supply lines, whether it is present day or whether it is 1857, supply lines are always key. So what did the supply lines look like in 1857? So for the Indians, typically when the Indian soldiers were part of the British Army, the supplies would be taken care of. So that would be something which would be purchased, granaries would be transported, and the soldiers would actually be transporting the food with them. Now, once the soldiers quote mutinied against the British, that means the entire logistical machine that was available to them as part of the British military was no longer available to them. So that means they had to depend on someone else for their food. So the chapatis were a message to the villages saying that they would be the ones providing for the soldiers when they were moving from, for example, in this case, we are showing the movement of the 17 NIs, the 17 native infantries marched from Azamgarh to Faizabad from June 3 to June 8. So if you look through there, they go through about 5 to 6 main towns that they go through, and it took them about 6 days. So that means every night they would be camping in one of these places. Now, at that time, the population was maybe every village was maybe 500 to 1,000 odd people. So when you have 1,000 or 2,000 hungry men walking through a village, if the village is not prepared, they would the soldiers will not be able to get food. So the chapatis were a message saying that we are willing to make the chapatis or make food for the villagers. And symbolically, very interestingly, again, several months before the war, one day thousands of women lined up along the Ganga, and they offered their balan to the river. And it was the book where I found this information. It was written by an English officer. Their explanation was that it was maybe a conspiracy by the spindle manufacturers. They call balan as spindle manufacturers, to increase their demand on to increase so that they can improve the sales of the balan. But as we know that a balan is a far more there's a huge tradition with the balan. So when these women were offering the balan, they were actually saying symbolically that we are willing to make the chapatis for the soldiers. So the villagers were a critical part of the supply line for the soldiers. Not only the food, but they also offered them bullock carts for transportation. So the chapatis represented the supply lines, and the red lotus flowers represented the logistics that needed to be planned. Now, if all this planning was going on several months before the war, who were the leaders of 1857? So for that, you have to roll back the clock and look at about 100 years before that, when during the time frame of Mahatji Shinde, so post Panipat, when the Marathas had pretty much taken control of most of India, liberated most of India from oppressive foreign rules. But when that transition took place, there was a very important pragmatic decision that Mahatji Shinde made. He could have easily deposed Shah Alam, who was the Mughal Badshah at that time, and made himself as the emperor of Hindustan. But he did not. He maintained Shah Alam II's position as the Shah as the emperor of India. And Marathas paid him a pension of 13 lakh rupees. So he was only the titular, and you can say in today's context he would be like the president of India, and Mahatji Shinde appointed himself as his prime minister. So that was a pragmatism, and that's what I describe as a Maratha Mughal alliance. And the alliance was important because this was roughly the time in which English power was rising. 1757, Bengal had come under British control, and they had started attacking most of the ports areas. British piracy was already rampant in the 1600s and 1700s. From the piracy, they had taken foothold on land, and they were now plundering many parts of India. So allying with the Mughals so that you can take on the British was something that was set in motion by Mahatji Shinde in the 1700s. So continuing with that legacy, in the 1800s, the leaders, so that included Nana Sahib Peshwa, Baizabai Shinde of Gwalior. So Baizabai Shinde, she was deposed by the British from being the regent of Gwalior in the 1830s. And then behind the scenes, she was actually working to reunite the Marathas to get together and launch a war against the British. And that did not work in the 1830s or 1840s. But when Nana Sahib became the Peshwa after Bajirao II died, he responded in kind. So, and then he reached out to Firoz Shah, who was the grandson of Bahadur Shah Zafar. And then along with Begum Hazrat Mahal, the Nawab of Banda, and several other kings, there was a coordinated plan. So letters were sent out to many Indian kings to kind of seek support, let them know of the rough plan. So who arranged these red lotus flowers and chapati messages? We believe that Tatya Tope, who was a mentor to both Nana Sahib as well as Rani Lakshmi Bai, he probably was a person who was behind the planning of the logistics of the war. Officially, Tatya Tope's position with Nana Sahib was he was kind of his minister or diwan, as is described in historical texts. And then there was another person called as Azimullah Khan, who was a suave young man who was sent by Nana Sahib to England in 1852 or so to get an idea of the British deployment across the world and their numerical strength. And this is something which militaries would guard very carefully. They would never reveal information about their deployment or about how large the army was, right? So Azimullah Khan, who was a very charming person, would get invited get himself invited to several social gatherings in London, and he would at a private level kind of dig out information as to what was the troop deployment, because the British troops at that point in time were deployed in the Middle East, in China, as well as in India. So the total military strength exceeded about 100,000. Of that, about 24,000 were deployed in India, but 70,000 were ready and available. And knowing that number was important. So the planning of the war started in 1852. And then once was set, it was important to communicate this information to other Indian kings. Now, at that point in time, most of the Indian kings would have some kind of a priest who would be the person who would be taking very important and private messages to other kings. Now, if these priests were caught traveling, it could raise suspicion amongst the British. So to kind of disguise the travel of these Brahmins, the court Brahmins, what Baizabai Shinde did was she arranged for a huge yajna in Mathura for June of 1857, and the invites of that yajna were sent out in the early months of 1857. So around January or February is when the invites were sent. So we know this from a book by Vishnu Bhatt Godse called as Maza Pravas, in which during Mahashivratri of 1857 February time frame, he set out on his journey because she was going to give a dakshina of a total of 7 lakh rupees, total dakshina of 7 lakh rupees to all the Brahmins who would come there. That amounts to, I think, about 30-40 crore rupees in today's terms. So that was a significant amount of dakshina that she was going to be giving. Now the purpose was very simple. It invited tons and tons of people, priests, to come to be traveling within India. So if anybody was asked, "Oh, why are you traveling?" the answer would be, "Oh, Mathura mein bada yajna hai." So that would be the reason. And under that pretext, the court Brahmins would now travel and take these messages from one king to other, where the logistics of the war were now discussed. Who arranged for the initial financing of the war? So Nana Sahib himself did that. Other kings did that, and then Baizabai's banker in Mathura, he also provided for all the logistics and all the money that was going to be needed to fund this war. So what was the reason for Indians to fight against the British, right? Now, 1857, as we are told, was a mutiny of sepoys. And what is taught in history books even today is that the British introduced the Enfield rifle, and the Enfield rifle used pig and cow oil in the cartridge to seal our cartridges, and it was hurting the religious sentiments of both Hindus and Muslims, and therefore that's the reason why the soldiers mutiny, right? Now, if you look at the actual situation in India at that time, the British rule was pretty oppressive. Taxation was at an all-time high. Trade was monopolized by East India Company and their affiliates and their license holders. There was state intervention in manufacturing. India had a highly dynamic, highly decentralized manufacturing of textiles, which controlled if technology and oil are the main factors in today's global trade. Textile and textile technology was the main factor in the 1800s, and India dominated nearly 40 to 50% of the global supply chain of textiles. There was also social oppression. The Bentinck proclamations of 1813 were shutting down Indian pathshalas. There was a collusion between the state with the missionaries with a full effort to convert India to Christianity. In fact, the word Juggernaut comes from Jagannath Yatra in Puri. So the missionaries were hell-bent on stopping the juggernaut of Hinduism, as they called it. So Macaulay, he had actually, with an effort to basically convert Indians, he had actually said the effect of English education on Hindus is prodigious. No Hindu who has received an English education ever remains sincerely attached to his religion. Then Benting's proclamation was the chief aim of our education policy was to promote the knowledge of European literature and science. In addition to that, they also banned the printing of Oriental books. The reverence of 1856 was also the time where there was a full-scale attack on trying to stop the Juggernaut Yatra. So the missionaries were celebrating. The country of 200 million has been claimed by the church. The whole land has been shaken by missionaries to its innermost core. The Hindu trembles for his religion and the Muhammad for his, and the Mohammedan for his. So just like the proclamation, the Declaration of Independence of the United States, in Azamgarh, there was a proclamation made by Nana Sahib and Firoz Shah, who was the grandson of Bahadur Shah Zafar, on August 25, 1857. It was a 5-point proclamation. It said that there is unfair taxation on the people of the country. The British are monopolizing trade and commerce by the English to the exclusion of Indians. There is a decline of India's industry on the livelihood of Indian manufacturers, so the weavers, the dyers, so the entire supply line of textiles, from production to from the production of cotton to the production of the textiles, everything was on a decline, and the slavery in Britain was also a competition. So it was a combination of forces. Then there was a denigration of public servants who work for the British bureaucracy. And the 5th point, which was I mentioned earlier, there's a stifling of individual freedom by imposing Christianity. Now, this is what I describe as a triad of freedom: the economic freedom, personal freedom, and political freedom. And the message in this 5-point proclamation was clear: help us gain political freedom so you can enjoy economic and personal freedom. And this resonated with the people. And this was also resonated with the soldiers. So rather than looking at it purely from a point of view of grease cartridges, there was something which the leadership motivated both the soldiers as well as the civilian population to support a large-scale war to overthrow the British. Now, the operation was very successful. Thousands of troops, starting May 10th, thousands of troops marched over 1 million man-miles, and then they gathered across the main areas where the British control centers existed. So Delhi to Banda, to Gwalior, to Jhansi, to Lucknow. So these were the places which got liberated right away. In a matter of a few months, large parts of North India were now free. We created an independent Indian government that was collecting its own taxes. The British systems were no longer functioning. Tatya Tope was the Diwan, so he became kind of like the minister for Nana Sahib's government in central India. As I mentioned earlier, we found about 125 letters written to Tatya Tope in Urdu. So these were found in archives, and then we worked with a professor in Jamia Millia who helped us find a translator. And we spent about 8 months translating these letters. From these letters, we find that there was a full-fledged Indian government in Bundelkhand and other parts of central India, which was responsible for several functions: civil functions, judicial functions, revenue collection, law and order, military, and other functions. So India, or at least parts of India, were now free. Right now, the British in the beginning, who had 25,000 soldiers, they knew that they had to bide for time. So the British response was quick, it was calculated, and it was chilling. It was chilling in 2 different ways. So they responded in 2 different ways. One was a defensive response. The defensive response was, in many of these garrisons, the British soldiers were with their families, with their wives and children. So the first instinct for any soldier, whether it is a British soldier or of any soldier, would be to protect their families. So the goal was to immediately evacuate the women. And as soon as, quote, the mutiny started or the war started, the instinct of the soldiers was to evacuate their wives, the women and the children out of these garrisons. However, they were sent an order coming from Calcutta to say that don't do that. You should not leave. You should not evacuate the women and children. They should be positioned with you. So the goal was to use their women and children as human shields. And it was very effective because, for example, when Nana Sahib was taking control, was attempting to take control of the garrison, the British garrison in Kanpur, it made it very difficult to to bomb the garrison because there were women and children present. So the British were able to delay and prolong their defensive thing until they were able to do a couple of things. So the second thing they did was there was an offensive response. Now any British general would ask the same question: is what about the supply lines? So where were the Indian soldiers getting the supplies from? And the answer they knew was that they were getting the supplies from Indian villagers. That means if the soldiers' supplies had to be cut off, that means the supply lines had to be cut off, and that meant attacking the villagers. So, and it was an extremely brutal attack. So Havelock and Neil, they arrived around late May, early June in Kolkata, and they started the campaign. They took a train with their, I think, 3 or 4 regiments all the way up to Varanasi, and they started. So if you look at the geography of North India, Ganga and Yamuna create a doab. Doab is like an area between these 2 rivers. And this was a time, especially June, July was a time frame for monsoons to set in. So once the rivers rise, it's very difficult for people to go across these rivers. So the figure of 8 campaign, we call it figure of 8 because the goal of the British was to depopulate the entire Doab area. In fact, there wasn't a single tree that was left along the banks of Ganga where there wasn't a dead body hanging. Women, children, old people, anybody from villages who were supporting the British soldiers was caught, either shot, killed, their houses burned, and killed and hanged by the trees. We call it the figure of 8 campaign because one such volunteer means people who are actually paid money to kill civilians, out of boredom arranged the dead bodies in a figure of 8 when he was hanging them by the tree. So this was an incredibly chilling response. The goal was very simple. The idea was to terrorize the Indian population, saying that if you provide food for the soldiers, you are going to be attacked directly, because they knew that they could not fight against the Indian soldiers, so they started killing Indian civilians. So the idea was to burn down every village, shoot villagers, women, children, and like I mentioned, there wasn't a single tree left along the Ganga without a dead body hanging. So that, you can say, that was phase 1 of the war. And the phase 1 of the war was the British soldiers not fighting the Indian soldiers, but really attacking Indian civilians. So phase 1, although Indians had taken control over most of the administrative functions of North India, at a core level, the British had destroyed the ability of the Indian soldiers to depend on the civilian population for support. So meanwhile, that gave the British time to transport about 70,000 soldiers into India. So from ships across the world, from Persia, from China, all the British troops, so these were Irish troops, Scottish troops, British troops, they were all being sent to India for the next phase of offensive campaign. But meanwhile, Indians has also realized that we could no longer depend on the villagers because the villagers were being targeted and killed. That means we needed to build our own supply lines. So Tatya Tope, what he did, and we call it the phase 2 of this war, was to deploy a fully functional logistical operation. So Kalpi, which is on the southern side of Yamuna, was made the capital because central India was still under Indian control. Parts north of the Ganga were under Indian control, but between the Yamuna and the Ganga, we had lost, right? So that was a portion which British were now completely controlling. The villages were depopulated, and most of the towns were now under British control. So the idea was to retake the Doab using fully functional supply columns. So Kalpi was used. A manufacturing facility was based in Kalpi. They were making cannons, for making carriages for the cannons. Plus, there was revenue coming from the Iqrarnamas that were signed with the chieftains of Bundelkhand. So phase 2 was actually successful, in which using that we were able to give Lucknow about 4 more months. So while other parts of India had, so Delhi had fallen in September of 1857 and other parts were slowly falling, but using Kalpi as a capital and providing supplies across the Doab, we were able to keep Lucknow for another 6 to 7 months beyond Delhi. I think until March or April or so, we continued to hold on to Lucknow. In the same time frame, even Jhansi was being attacked by British. Hugh Rose, who was a general at that time, he and General Hamilton were both fighting for Lakshmibai's head, because there was a prize of 30,000 pounds, and that's a lot of money for the 1800s, which was there on Rani's head. So a part of phase 2 was also to help Rani Lakshmibai to prevent her from being captured by the British. And so we detail out in the book as to Tatya Tope. He actually was able to ensure that Lakshmibai gets the regiment. There was actually a regiment of soldiers who used to fight by Lakshmibai that Tatya Tope had borrowed for the earlier phase of the war. And that regiment had to be redeployed in Jhansi, who could help Lakshmibai break out. So these were some of the successes of phase 2. Now, the phase 2 ended again with the British mounting a humongous genocide. So after the siege of Jhansi, pretty much the town of Jhansi was decimated. The population was terrorized. Any leader, any Bundeli leader who was found to have supported financially Tatya Tope was hanged. Now that led to with the broker Iqrarnamas without funding coming in, phase 2 was very difficult to sustain. Now this is when you would have assumed that the war would have technically ended, but many people did not give up, including Tatya Tope. So there was now a phase 3 launch, where most of the cities, most of the towns were now taken back by the British, but soldiers were still willing to fight. So we still needed money. You still needed soldiers. The soldiers still needed money. So Baizabai Shinde and Jiaji Rao, who was the king of Gwalior at that time, they orchestrated a drama because in many ways, Jiaji Rao was he was about 21, 22 years old, and Baizabai Shinde was in her 50s, and she didn't want young Jiaji Rao to be captured and killed by the British. So they acted out, telling the British that we are on your side, just the way Lakshmibai did in her earlier months of the war, saying that, oh, I'm loyal to you, but secretly she was helping the soldiers. Similarly, Baizabai and Jiaji Rao were also helping the soldiers in private, but publicly they were saying that they are loyal to the British. So they arranged a dramatic fall of the Gwalior fort, and they said that, oh, sorry, our soldiers could not fight, and then the treasury was emptied out, and I think 6 or 7 lakh rupees were given to the soldiers, and that allowed for Tatya Tope's army to continue then buy the supplies, because obviously if civilians were providing chapatis for free, that meant the wrath of the British, but they could now buy supplies from the market and then use that to feed the soldiers. So phase 3 of the war was launched using Gwalior's treasury, and meanwhile, by that time, the English had brought 70,000 soldiers into India, and then they were stationed at these strongholds. So the plan for phase 3 was to resurrect local rebellions and to scatter the British away from the English strongholds. So there were still many towns and villages that were willing to fight against the British. The cities were now taken back by the British. So the goal would be to scatter the British into remote areas so that the cities could be taken back again. So at least that was the plan. These are some of the maps that kind of show Tatya Tope's troop movement. So in whether it was in Rajputana, General Mitchell was given 5 entire columns to put an end to Tatya Tope's campaign. And pretty much everywhere, with the help of local support and with the help of in the case of Rajputana, he was able to get the help from the Bhil army. In everywhere, Tatya Tope was able to hand over the local towns and villages back to any local resistance that existed. So that was in Rajputana, that was in central India, in Jakhlon. Now, this is at this point in time, the British expected that Tatya Tope's army would be defeated. Yet, almost every battle, Tatya Tope was able to defeat the British troops. Now, South India so far, so south of Narmada, there were some brief attempts to fight the British, but that had not yet risen. So, relatively speaking, the British were not concerned until Tatya Tope's movement in Middle India, in Central India, that South India status could change. So the idea was to prevent Tatya Tope from crossing the Narmada. So every effort was put to prevent Tatya Tope from crossing the Narmada, and there was a full-on war between the British and Tatya Tope. However, Tatya Tope was able to break through those British soldiers, and he crossed the Narmada. Now, this actually sent shockwaves through the British, because if this would lead to the soldiers from the Madras army and the Bombay army to rebel, that could completely change the status quo of the war again. So the 5-point proclamation that the Indians had made against the British decided that they will concede on something. The only way to quell is to finally concede on something. So as I mentioned, that Indians, we were asking for economic freedom, political freedom, as well as personal freedom. What the British decided is that once Tatya Tope had crossed, it was important to concede something to India, so that to kind of say that, okay, you don't need to fight anymore because maybe you have won at least something. So we can call it fractional freedom. What was done in November of 1858 was that the British said that we're going to dissolve the East India Company. All the conversions that were taken place were blamed on the East India Company. East India Company was shut down. All the atrocities were blamed on the East India Company against India. And the Queen said that the British rule is going to be a different rule. We are no longer going to be interfering in matters of faith. Religious conversions were officially no longer going to be supported by the state. Now, of the 3 freedoms, India had one of the 3. That means at least part of the personal freedom India had achieved in the War of 1857. Now, there were some leaders who said that, that's good enough. It's not worth fighting anymore. So there were many. So to an extent, the British giving an olive branch worked. The Nawab of Banda surrendered himself, and others surrendered. But Tatya Tope marched on. He said, no, we need to continue fighting. And so did Firoz Shah. So Firoz Shah and Tatya Tope. Firoz Shah was fighting in the north, and Tatya Tope was campaigning in central India. So the plan for phase 4 was to scatter the British Indian troops. So Firoz Shah was engaged in the north, and the idea was to rendezvous with Firoz Shah in I think Pratapgarh or so. Tatya marched through the English defenses. He got the help of several local soldiers. But something important happened on January 1, 1859. Tatya Tope actually died in battle. This is contrary to what our history books tell. So this is actually an eyewitness account of Major Paget. Major Paget was part of the British brigade that was in battle with Tatya Tope's troops. So this is from the book that his wife published, and he wrote his account in the appendix, and this is something that he witnessed. The enemy on the right stood their ground well, and were being led and encouraged by a native conspicuously dressed in white and mounted on a handsome white horse. He waved his sword and was evidently encouraging them to charge the guns, when suddenly a round shot knocked him and his horse. It was Tatya Tope himself. 2 days later, we heard the news that Tatya Tope had died. Now, this was in a place in Rajasthan called as Chipa Barod. In fact, to confirm Tatya Tope's death, General Mitchell also arrived in the scene. Now, the interesting thing was that Tatya Tope had become the face of resistance against the British for a lot of Indians. So he was actually motivating a lot of people to continue to battle the British. So who was remaining were Rao Bahadur, Firoz Shah, and so it was not in their interest to advertise Tatya Tope's death. So Tatya Tope, from an Indian point of view, his death did not need to be advertised. So Indians did not proclaim that Tatya Tope had died, and since not too many people really knew him by face, his name was being used to continue battling. But you can see from the troop movement and as well as the battle tactics, starting about January, February, the Indian resistance had weakened, and the British knew that Tatya Tope was a metaphor for freedom. And so on April 19th, when they hanged who they claimed to be Tatya Tope was someone else. We don't really know who that person was. There are all kinds of stories about who it was. The story in the family was that Tatya Tope was definitely not hanged and maybe he lived on. So there are all kinds of rumors and innuendos about what happened to Tatya Tope. But as this eyewitness account indicates, that Tatya Tope had actually died in battle in January 1, 1859. So like I mentioned earlier, 1857 was a battle lost, but a war won. And why was it a war won? For an ancient civilization such as India, there are things which, sure, money is important and being plundered economically hurts, and there was starvation and there was poverty. But eventually, for a nation to survive, your cultural roots need to be strengthened. And that is what the British were assaulting in the period from the 1830s onwards. And if 1857 had not happened, those roots could have been completely destroyed, and the India civilizational tree could have been completely uprooted. So 1857 prevented that from happening. So at least it was a fractional victory. And also the reason for the British to concede this freedom is because offensive wars are very expensive. In fact, 1857 was so expensive that the British had to liquidate their assets in the US, in New York and other places, pretty much sell off all their assets to hire the mercenaries, the 70,000 soldiers. They were not going to die because this wasn't a defensive war for them. So they needed a lot of money, a lot of incentive to fight. So silver was being given as an incentive, and there was so much of cashing out of the assets from the US that there was an economic crisis in the US. It's called as the Panic of 1857. Versus from an Indian point of view, it was a defensive war. That means you're defending your home, so even a negative return on investment is acceptable. So the British conceded, saying that, okay, if we need to continue to plunder India economically, we need to concede something, and we'll concede personal freedom. So if you look from a point of view of 1857, there were several players. We can call it like the way you can look at history is if you have your blinders on, it's like the 6 blind men and the elephant. And some of them touch the tail, some of them touch the legs. The person who touches the tail thinks it's a snake. The person who touches the legs thinks it's a tree, and so on, right? So if you look at the War of 1857, the whole elephant includes the collaborators, which would be the leadership, which would be Nana Sahib, Tatya Tope, Hazrat Mahal, Lakshmi Bai, Bahadur Shah Zafar. Then you had the civilians who supported with the chapatis and the soldiers. The covert behavior, because this was planned in secret, the covert behavior of the leaders was planning the recon mission, doing the yajna, planning for the logistics. The civilians would be providing for the food through the Chapati Messages, and the soldiers were covertly using the red lotus flowers. The overt behavior was that Nana Sahib complained that, oh, I'm not getting my pension, or Lakshmi Bai saying that my son, my adopted son, is not being allowed to become king, so therefore I am angry. Nana Sahib said that I am angry, and then so on, right? So that was the overt behavior. The civilians' overt behavior was doing these strange ritualistic things, such as offering the bill into the Ganga. And the overt behavior of the soldiers was being upset at the grease cartridges. And the key role for the leadership was strategic planning and economic planning, uh, logistics, the civilians in terms of food, and soldiers actually doing the battles. Right now, if you were to look at 1857 from a different point of view. So if you want to look at 1856 as a mutiny, what would you look at? You would look at soldiers, you'd look at the grease cartridges, and you look at the motivation. So was 1857 not a mutiny? Well, in a way it was, because the soldiers definitely mutinied against the British. In fact, I would say this is not just it wasn't just a great mutiny as the British call it, but I would say this was the greatest mutiny in humanity, in humankind. I mean, no mutiny would have the support of 58,000 soldiers. 75 or 80% of Indian soldiers were willing to give up their livelihood, give up their paycheck, and fight against the British. Nowhere else were mercenary soldiers willing to do something like this. So was it a mutiny? Yes, but that's not the complete story. Then there was a new way to look at India's history, and that was after India became free. So this was a time in which Marxist and communism was on the rise, and for them everything was about people's war, people's war. So the goal was to package 1857 as a civil rebellion of 1857, and to discard the role of the leadership, and to say that the soldiers were only discontented. So now the Marxists wanted to present it as a civilian rebellion, and to say that there's a volunteer army. Now, was there a volunteer army? There, of course, was a volunteer army. Were the civilians involved? Yes, they were involved. But is the civil rebellion a complete description of 1857? It is not. It was a part of 1857. Then you had a state-appointed historians like Surendranath Sen or other well-known historians such as R.C. Mazumdar. They wanted to present this as a feudal revolt. And was it feudal revolt because, well, Bahadur Shah was disgruntled, or Nana Sahib was unhappy, discontented because he was not being given pension, or Lakshmi Bai was unhappy because her son was not being allowed to make king. So were those grievances true? Yes, they were true. Was it the only motivation? No. So you could package 1857 in many different ways. So for example, about 5-6 years ago, there was a book written by a Marathi author called as 1857 Jihad, the Jihad of 1857. And there he translated some of the Urdu letters that the Muslim soldiers were writing to each other, in which they were looking at it as a religious war, as a jihad against the British. Now, was 1857 a jihad? Well, elements of the soldiers who were fighting against the British were fighting for their religion, and therefore there would be a jihad that would be a part of 1857. But to call 1857 as a jihad is incomplete. So, for example, if we wanted to present 1857 as a women's war, we could very well do that, because women played a very important role in 1857. So the narrative, each of these narratives are true, but they are not true in totality. So the reason why most historians have their blinders on is because they don't understand the Indic paradigm. India is the only place, only nation in the world where there is an unbroken continuity of the land, the people, and the stories that are told across generations. And many would think that China would fall into a similar category. That is not true. Once Buddhism went to China, pretty much the entire socio-cultural aspect of China changed. Buddhism, Buddha's stories, all the stories, all the events in China, the past got, in a way, erased from everything else was kind of pushed to the sideline, and the Buddhist stories became dominant. The same you'll see in the Middle East. Pretty much, if you look at Turkey or if you look at Greece, those places in the last 2,000 or 3,000 years were systematically, one civilization would come, another religion would come, convert them, another religion would come, reconvert them. Pretty much the stories would change. The continuity was always broken. In fact, Allama Iqbal, before he became a more radical person, he wrote Tarana-e-Hindi, in which he wrote, Yunan Misra Ruma sab mit gaye jahan se ab tak magar hai baki namo nisha hamara. Yunan, Misr, and Ruma means Greece, Egypt, and Rome. He says that Greece, Egypt, and Rome have those ancient civilizations have vanished without a trace. Ab tak magar hai baki namo nisha hamara. Yet India lives on. Kuch baat hai ki hasti mitti nahi hamari. There's something about us that our existence doesn't fade away. So understanding the Indian nation has something which, to an extent, Macaulay succeeded, because many of the English-speaking Indians who participated in the official writing of history were not able to distinguish between India the nation and India the state. So India the state as a modern state came into being in 1947, and events that started in 1946. But the Europhilia forced the modern discourse to view India from a very narrow perspective. So in terms of economic freedom, in terms of political freedom, and in terms of personal freedom, India is the only place which has an understanding of this triad of freedom, and they have maintained it in different forms. So even in the last 1,000 years, where there was a loss of personal freedom, there were several attempts to resurrect that, and 1857 is a continuation of that effort. So 1857 was an example of the desire of Indian people to fight for freedom. So if you fast forward to 1935, 1956, the goal here is to understand what is it that remains unfinished from 1857. Economically, India remained in chains, and politically, India remained in chains. So when the resistance to the British started to increase in the early 1900s, the British created something called as the Reserve Bank of India. They created the Government of India Act of 1935. And when they saw World War II was inevitable, they wanted Indian soldiers for help. So now Indians responded saying that, okay, this is a great opportunity, because after 1857, the British had completely disarmed India. In fact, in 1867, there was a act where Indian population was disarmed. In fact, Gandhi himself, in his Experiments with Truth, actually called that act as the blackest deed of the British. The disarming of India was the blackest deed of the British. So once the clouds of World War II were on the horizon, the British needed Indian troops. So Indians said that, okay, this is a great opportunity to militarize India by Indianizing the military. Because Indian soldiers were not armed anymore, it was going to be very difficult to throw the British out. But once World War II became obvious, the idea was to militarize India. And that process started. In fact, my father has actually heard Savarkar's speech in the late 1930s or early 1940s, in which he actually told the people that Yuddhat Bharti hua, join the army, take those weapons and turn them against the British. So 1945, World War II ended. Germany and Japan were defeated. Subhash Chandra Bose with alliance with Japan ended with the defeat of the Japanese after Pearl Harbor. Subhash Chandra Bose himself died. Now the English and many Indians were under the naive belief that after World War II is over, the British will just get up and leave. They showed no such plans. In fact, in 1942, they cut off supply lines to Bose's army, and they did what they had done earlier. They starved almost 4 million Bengalis to death just to prevent Bose's army from entering Bengal. And then after World War II ended, they started the Iron Age trials in 1946. Now, this is where once the Iron Age trials started, there was the Indian army now, which was militarized. Now we had weapons, and we had ships, and we had planes. They were under Indian control, not too different than 1857. This time, we played it out very differently. It was a very significant day. 18th February 1946, HMIS Talwar, His Majesty's Indian ship Talwar, was a signal ship. It lowered the Union Jack and raised the Azad Hind flag. So Azad Hind flag was the flag that Bose was using as part of the INA. The ship was renamed as instead of the HMIS, it was named as the INNS. Today we call our ships as INS, Indian Naval Ship. In 1946, we called it the Indian National Naval Ship, because that was the Indian National Army. So it was the Indian National Naval Ship Talwar. It was a communication ship. and it communicated with 78 other ships and 20 shore establishments all the way from Karachi to Chittagong. So the entire coast of India from Karachi to Chittagong was communicated with. In a matter of hours, the British were overpowered, and Indians had taken control of all the naval establishments during that day. The guns were aimed at all English establishments in all the port locations. Now, this time, the British had two choices. The British could now use, because the Navy was under Indian control, they ordered the Indian Air Force to take off. The Indian Air Force refused to take off. They ordered the Army to take over the ground establishments of the Navy. The Army refused to fire. Now, there was a complete strike. Now, the British had two choices. The first choice was to send their British Army again into India. But now this army was weakened after World War II. They didn't have enough motivation. So they took the second choice. In a matter of 24 hours, on February 19th, 1946, Pethick Lawrence announced a simultaneous gathering of the House of Lords and House of Commons. This is not very common. This is not very usual. And announced that in view of paramount importance, not only to India and the British Commonwealth, but the peace of the world, His Majesty's government has decided to send out to India a special mission to work out the details of India's independence. India's independence was announced one day after the event of 18th February 1946. 15th August 1947 was a culmination of this announcement that took place in 1946. So we can say, if you were to look at the period of the British rule, 1835 to 1858 was a rule of darkness, where pretty much we had lost economic freedom, political freedom, and personal freedom. 1857 changed that. We can say that there was some fractional freedom, personal freedom, maybe we recovered some of that. In 1946, I would say it's still a work in progress. I would say we have reasonable political freedom. It's still there are things which are rooted in an ethos which is not Indian, but that can change. In fact, that would be the goal of our goal, to kind of take India as a nation and build it on the roots that were founded on the ideas of looking at the world as a family. Economic freedom also needs to be improved, and there are many aspects where the government interferes. For example, in even today's education, today's way of looking at India's education is still a very Eurocentric point of view. So those are the things that we need to fix. That is all that I have for my presentation today. If there are any questions, we can do any questions.
So, Paragji, first of all, I'd like to thank you for this wonderful, brief that you actually gave us about the war. And I'm sure there are many questions which have come in to us actually. So I would like to, maybe I can begin with sharing a few with you.
Sure, absolutely.
Yes. So the first question is from Mr. Piyush, who has asked that what would it take us to include this history in school books?
So one of the things that I had mentioned as my interest was what I call as decapitalizing history, and you had mentioned that as part of in my introduction. So what I mean by decapitalizing history is that the letter in history being capital, I make that as an analogy to Abrahamic religions, where there's a definite idea of God, and they always capitalize God with a capital G. That's a very definite idea of what God is. Similarly, humanity subjects, the way they are taught, I mean, I've been living in the US now for 33 years now. The way humanity subjects are taught in the West are very similar to that idea. It's a very definitive, very fixed idea of what has happened. I call that history with a capital H. The education system in India, unfortunately, has inherited this notion of very fixed idea of what has happened in the past, a definitive idea. So the way it is defined is there are a set of people who or certified intellectuals. The certified intellectuals would attend universities, get certifications with PhDs, and then they would certify what would be considered as official history, and that this official history would be now shoved down people's throats. Now, this is something which has always been happening, right? This has been the model that the British have used, and this is something that India inherits even today. Now, there are two ways we can do this. We can say that, okay, so far what has been shoved down our throats, the history that we've been told, has been flawed, and therefore let's correct it, and let's teach the correct form of history to our students. Now, the way, again, and this is something which I think should be debated. This should be something which should be a part of a discourse where organizations such as Bhavyata and others should play an important part in saying, well, what is it that we really want to do? Humanities, the way our civilization has looked at it, was always something that was embodied in part of your life. Every festival that we do, everything that we do, in a way celebrates humanity, celebrates history. So even, for example, growing up in Maharashtra, in Pune, whether or not school books talked about Shivaji was, you go to the forts, you hear the stories of Shivaji. There is Shiva Jayanti. These have nothing to do with schools. Its part is alive and kicking in society. Indian stories have an ability. We have a tradition which allows storytelling to exist in addition to or separately from what is taught in school. So my personal view, and this is something which I would say that this should be debated, is whether do we want to continue the European model of insisting that there is a definitive idea of history. I do not for a minute think that Operation Red Lotus is anything definitive at all. All it does is challenges the notions and presents an alternative point of view. It may be right, it may be wrong, and that's okay. And that's the nature of history. That's the nature of anything that we don't know certainly about. We don't know certainly about anything about the God with a capital G. It finally comes down to your individual ideas, and that is what our strengths are. My view is that by decapitalizing history, we should let society take control, take ownership of history, and let schools play a supporting role rather than the schools playing a dominating role. The schools should play a supporting role, and let society take control of what we have always done best, and that is retell story. And then there is plenty of material in terms of even events such as 1857 or other historical events that exist in a parallel world in our societies, and that should be given prominence. And the curriculum should be less about fixed ideas of what has happened and more ideas that enable students to be inquisitive and to learn and to ask questions as to what may have happened, and let them come to their own conclusions as to what may have happened. Does that answer the question?
So it was a very nice explanation that you gave, Paragji, and I'm very happy to hear what you've said, and I'm sure so is the audience. I would also like to request our founder for Bhavita Foundation, Krishna Chaitanya ji, to join you on this, because he has been and the organization also has been corely working on education, and like you said, we are together looking forward to making history as the right history as a part of the Indian education system, and of course even to take it globally. So I now request Krishna Chaitanya ji to please put a little highlights on the same topic.
Thank you, Parag ji. It was great to keep this to at least in the previous conversation we wanted to Parag ji wanted to talk on decapitalization, and I think so the straight question that came was connected to this theme. And even I could not resist commenting on this, because this is what we actually wanted to take this sessions to go further, as per our previous conversation with Paragji also. And his whole family practically is ready to jump into this bandwagon or decapitalization of the history. And a message to our viewers and participants is that we don't want this to be a specialist kind of thing that we wait for the historians to correct the textbooks. They'll come into the mainstream education system. Indian thought and Indian way of life is that everything is communicated through family and generations, and through a parampara of the community, the village. each one has its own history. We don't have to worry about the history of the world or global or even the Indian as a whole. We have so much of history rich even in the local village traditions. Even those would also help us to uh, appreciate the more deeper aspects of the Indian history, which is connected to grassroots. And everybody has a story to share. Practically everybody has a history to share. Just that I was thinking that it could be a hobby of the teens. I was seeing some questions and they were saying that how should we get the teens to come out of this? Teens should just connect with their grandparents, to their families, and get the history. And that could be a history in the family narrative. Also, we are very keen on taking this forward. The whole goal of this Bharat Gatha series was designed in a way that we could get people to own up for coming back to discovering their own history in their own way, as the Indian tradition was all about. So my request to all our participants is that those who are eager to be part of this movement further, we are committed to take these history sessions every Saturday throughout the whole year. That is what the foundation is committed to, and it is not just going to be a highlight of a certain very significant event at like 1857. Like every historical moment was a very significant event. Only that we need to see it from a perspective, and the communication that needs to be done to the people around you would bring to the idea of the decapitalization of the history and make history as a ownership for the community. So the idea is that we want you to come and join in to a forum where it could be a group, a Google group forum, online forum, and a regular discussion forum that would be online on every Saturdays. And the themes for the coming weeks also would be decided in that. It will be very nice that we could have this forum in various languages also. Hopefully, we'll also try to do it in Hindi for some few people who request for the children. So there we go into the session for the children also. So Paragji, would you also pitch in for like how do we take this forward? Because we'd like everybody to be this as experienced as yourself, and with the team of people whom you also know, would take this forward with people who are interested even in this forum and beyond this forum.
Well, I would say that every individual who's motivated to look at the past can just pick an area of any past. I mean, when you say history, you can, especially for India, you can go from 50,000 years. I mean, in this slide, for example, I talk about, we know, if you look at the precession of the earth, we know that our ancestors knew about Abhijit when he became a pole star. That was 13,000 years ago. So there are people who would be interested in extreme ancient times, or people could be interested in 30 events of 30 years ago. That basically we can motivate anybody to at least start, not to wait, as you suggested, not to wait for specialists to do their job. Let's start putting together material. Let's start, finally, if things are based on evidence and things are based on logic and things are based on reason, that is all that you need to convince other people. You don't need certification. The idea that someone needs to certify this, it's a very alien concept to our culture. So let's not wait for certified intellectuals to do things. Let's start doing things on our own. Now, there'll be some political change that needs to happen as well, and that's something that we can try to influence, and there could be certain ways of doing it. So, for example, a simple change, which is not dramatic, which is not revolutionary, would be to simply say that in year 2030, the government schools will no longer require history curriculum to be defined by the government. That's all. You don't have to say that you're taking history out of schools. You simply say that the curriculum could be defined by at local levels. And the local, so that means that will motivate the teachers, that will motivate the families, that will motivate individuals in that area to say, well, these are the kinds of things that we want to talk about, right? So combine that with people who are now inspired to look at the past, who have done their research, because effort is important, scholarship is important. At no point in time should we take shortcuts in scholarship. But you don't have to wait for certification. You don't have to wait for the government to do things. This is something that we can do in parallel, and then the government can play a supportive role in reviving the way our history was taught. And you can use the classrooms that exist and in representing that.
The idea was from the is that how do you find the authentic sources of history when there is so much of academic history which has gone awry and which has gone against the Indian narrative since post-independence?
So I mean, I would say that you have to encourage those people who like to challenge contexts. So for example, if you look, so I'll give you an example of a direct contradiction between in, let's say, history of, let's say, from 2500 years ago. If you look at Chandragupta and Ashok, these two emperors, right? History books take up a significant amount of space for when you talk about that period of India. They talk a lot about Chandragupta and Ashok. Now, if you look at Indian sources, for example, not the sources of the kings themselves, but from the Puranas or from the texts that our ancestors, society has preserved, Chandragupta is barely mentioned, and Ashoka is also mentioned only in passing. Vikramaditya, on the other hand, who was after these two kings, is put on a pedestal. And in fact, we have a calendar named after him. What makes Vikramaditya different than Chandragupta and Ashoka? Why is it that the academics love Chandragupta and Ashoka? And why is it that our ancestors did not think much about of those two, but they think highly of Vikramaditya? Now, this is a question. Now, I don't have the answer. I have some theory, but somebody who is interested, somebody who is understands Sanskrit, somebody who can read ancient texts, somebody who can. So we need to start from scratch. We cannot depend on Marxist narratives and tell us that this is important, that is important. We don't. If our ancestors decided that Ashoka was okay, he was somebody not worthy of being considered Ashoka the Great, or Chandragupta. Yeah, sure. I mean, Kautilya story has been presented in Mudra Rakshas. What else is there? I mean, was Arthashastra a dominant logic that was being promoted in India? There doesn't seem to be evidence to indicate that. Is there evidence? So I'm not stating an answer, but I'm simply raising questions. Now, anybody who would be, this is an example of you ask questions, and there will be plenty of people. I'm positive that you'll find hundreds of people who have the ability to do research on these topics and try to do some inquiry on these and say that, okay, maybe we have answers to that, right? So when you challenge everything at a theoretical level, and then the research will automatically follow. Now, if you're making such a strong claim, for example, you would have to have evidence, you have to have scholarship, you have to do a lot of work to do that. So that will come automatically. You don't really need to go up against academics. You simply state your position and you show this is what you have. That's all that is needed.
So basically, it would mean to all individual research and going deeper into the history. I would be happy to have Samiraji take more questions. You would have a lot of questions, and they're all waiting to hear answers from you.
Yeah, sure. But thank you for this, conversation. I'm sure it has helped a lot of, a lot of people in the audience to think over how they can join in. So I would say that you can volunteer over, sharing your comments and helping us write about these narratives. So for that, you can contact. We'll share on the chat box the contact number. But for all of you, I would still repeat the Bharatiya Foundation contact number, which is 750-688-2281. So you all could contact us on that, message us, or even on our website, click for the volunteering option and volunteer with us for the same. With this, I take the next question, Paragji, which is asked by Mr. Piyush, who has said that as Savantraveer Savarkar has written in one of his books, Hindus suffer from extreme tolerance, Ati Sahinstuta. So how much this played a part in losing the 1857 war?
So I don't think the word tolerance, Sahishnutta, is relevant in the context of 1857. I think once we declared war, I would say that now the question is, whether attacking women and children, which is what the British did to Indians, whether Indians should have responded in kind, which we did not. I don't think Savarkar would have ever supported doing that either. Now the question is, from at least our ancient history, the battle between Asuras and Devas. I mean, the thing is that there are certain things that you have to be pragmatic about, but there are certain things, that certain lines you don't cross. I would say 1857 was an example of leadership, an example of picking and choosing our battles. And I think India's greatest strength is knowing when to pick battles, because you have to let a generation pass before you can motivate people to fight again. Versus the enemy, relatively speaking, has relatively unlimited resources because they can use money and they can hire mercenaries to go against us. Versus we are fighting defensive wars. So you have to pick our battles closely. Whether if we go back to the past, and if I were to, let's say, if I was to go back and advise Tatya Tope, what would we do differently? I honestly don't know what we could have done differently to prevent this, because if the British were going after Indian civilians, the answer to that cannot be easy. So essentially, we did what we could, and we said that, okay, the rest will fight another day. And this is something which you have to understand, that for an ancient nation, 60, 70, 80 years is not a huge time frame. And so therefore, the ego, the ahankar of our lifetime, that I need to see something in my lifetime change. If we give up on that and see that, okay, change and transformation are going to happen, but we have to lay the seeds for it and do whatever that can be done in our lifetimes. And that can help future generations. I would say that our ancestors in 1857, that is the thought that they left us with. Rather than to go back and do ifs and buts and what we could have done differently, that's something which I don't think either are, you will never see. In fact, one of the things that, one of the points that I make in this decapitalizing history is that if you look at pretty much anything which would be considered history from a Hindu point of view, from our ancient texts, you will never see any finger pointing. You will never see that, for example, even in Ramayana, you talk about the rise of Ravan. Now, Ravan became all powerful. That means he must have defeated some kings. Some kings lost. Some kings must have betrayed. Some kings must have done this. Some kings must have done that. You don't see any mention of that. Why is it? Why is it that our historical texts don't have any supposed analysis and supposedly any self-flagellation? Why is it that? Is it because we are naive and we don't like to capture lessons? On the contrary, I would say our ancestors came up with a brilliant formulation of capturing, to make stories empowering, to make stories very positive, and then capturing the lessons learned and putting them in a completely different format. Guess what that format is? That format would be Hitopadesh and Panchatantra. You don't have to point fingers at Prithviraj Chauhan and say, look at this naive king who forgave his enemy X number of times. You could simply make Prithviraj Chauhan as a turtle, the forgiving turtle, and simply tell that story. You don't have to do finger pointing. Those are the constraints of our civility. We don't point fingers. If your intention was bona fide and you made mistakes, you just let that go, capture the lesson, keep that in some other form, and move on. If our intentions are malified, then yeah, you denounce the malified intentions. But the idea to look back at 1857 and say that, okay, what we did wrong or what we didn't do wrong is unnecessary. I'm pretty sure we can look at our past and look at more empowering ways of looking at our history than try to go back and say what is wrong with us. I would say that given that we are the only living civilizations, we have a lot going for our success rather than our failure.
Thank you, Paragji. I'm sure this answer was a very, very good piece of advice also, and an insight for everyone to think about, that it's a positive aspect that we always need to also focus on quite a many times, because that is something which is very important. And like you said, yes, India does have a lot to, keep on and on giving and giving coming generations. So with this, I'm going to take a next question, which is from Mr. Ganesh, who has asked that it is said that the 1857 Swatantra Rai Samar, wrote by Veer Savarkar, but banned by Britishers. Will you please throw some light on this?
Can you, the first part of your voice got cut off. Can you repeat the first half of your question?
Okay. So, written by Veer Savarkar, the Savantra Samar, which is, it is said that in 1857, it was written by Veer Savarkar but banned by Britishers. So they want to know about this.
It's a very interesting history. So Savarkar was, I think, in his mid 20s when he went to London, and he used to spend several hours during the weekdays in the libraries, and he would read up all the British books, and then on weekends he would give lectures to, I think, the India Club. I forget the name of it, but he would have an audience who would be enamored because he was a brilliant orator, and he would give talks. And so he, at one point in time, he got interested in 1857. So every once a week he would give these lectures on 1857, and he did that for over a period of 6 months. And there would be people in the audience who would take notes, and those notes were compiled and they were made into a book called as 1857 se Swatantra Samar. Now what happened was that this was roughly 1906 or 1907 or so. Now they tried to publish the book, but the publishers in England, from what I remember, is that they didn't have the right font. I mean, in today's term it would be called as font, but it was, I think, called as the right type for the printing. So the Nagari fonts that were needed for the book were not available. So they started looking for publishers elsewhere. Now the British got a wind of this book being coming out. So actually what happened was that once they could not find the printer, they said, okay, let's hold off on publishing the Marathi book. Let's translate that into English, because finding people to publish in English will be much easier. Once the British got the wind that an English book on 1857 is going to come out by Savarkar, they proscribed the book. They banned the book. In fact, this is the first time in England's history that a book was banned even before it was published. So all printers in Britain were told that you will not print this book. So hurriedly, Savarkar and his friends had to find a printer in Holland who was willing to print that book. And those, so 1857 se Swatantra Samar was actually first translated and published under 1857 War of Independence. By the way, Savarkar did not call it first. The word first was added by Marxists because Karl Marx apparently claimed that it was like, from a communist point of view, it became like a first thing. Anyway, that aside, the English book was published first, and then later on those copies were smuggled into India, and then the manuscript in Marathi was smuggled into India, and I think then it was printed in India. So that book itself has a very interesting history, and Savarkar was the first person to challenge the historical context of 1857. He saw that this was not something small. In fact, the grandness of it, he was the first person to challenge that this was a war, not a mutiny. And that is something which was an unfinished business. So 1907, he published the book, which is 50 years after 1857. 1957, when India was free, that would have been the right time to finish Savarkar's. Now, Savarkar's goal in 1907 was very clear. He wanted India to be free. So he was not being a historian. He was not trying to go into the past to dig the details and write a book about analysis. His idea was to use 1857 as a lever to motivate Indians to fight against the British, right? But it was still a great effort that Savarkar had put in writing 1857 se Swatantra Samar. 1957 would have been a great time to continue where he had left off, but unfortunately that wasn't done. So when we started writing in 2006, 2007, our goal was to finish Savarkar's unfinished agenda of continuing to tell the story of 1857. Thanks for asking that question.
With this, I have another question from Keshik, Mr. Keshik wants to know that what is your opinion on Nepal's role? They send Gurkha regiments against the mutineers.
So you have to think from, so this is a very social point of view. This is typically what Marxists do. The focus is on identity and division. And unfortunately, we have fallen trapped to these identities and division. In fact, when I said earlier that 1857 wasn't just a mutiny, it was the greatest mutiny. I mean, even today, think about it. Let's say that if we are told that Zoom is a Chinese product, merely giving that up, we find it so difficult. Now, think from a soldier's point of view. Their entire livelihood, they are mercenary soldiers. Their livelihood, their daily wages, their source of food, the source of supporting the family is coming from East India Company. To one day say that I'm going to give up on that, and not only that, I'm going to actually fight against the British. That is an incredible achievement. No other mercenary army, every army is a mercenary army. No mercenary army in the world has ever challenged their master and taken up gun against and killing them. This is unique to India. Rather than looking at the Gorkhas or whoever who chose not to who chose not to act, rather than looking that as a betrayal, let's look at the sepoys who actually took that risk and died doing this. Again, let's focus on what is unique about India and the fact that only Indians could pull off a greatest mutiny on the planet.
Thank you, Paragji, for answering. And I'm sorry that was Kaushik's question. So, Kaushik, thank you for this question. After this, I have a question from Mr. JR, who has asked us that can you give some color on what was happening south of Narmada during the War of Independence?
So that wasn't my area of research. My focus was really, I mean, because it was about Tatya Tope, and Tatya Tope's circle of influence was pretty much north of the Narmada. But I know a little bit. For example, one of the key elements of decoding Operation Red Lotus was a testimony by Sitaram Baba. So Sitaram Baba was a court-appointed court Brahmin for Nana Sahib Peshwa. Now he would be one of the people who would be carrying messages from Nana Sahib to other people, right? In January 15 or so of 1858, he was actually caught and arrested and tortured in Bangalore, in Bengaluru in South India, and he was caught with letters which the British obviously have not disclosed, but his testimony is actually disclosed and it's available in the archives, and it's actually fascinating reading. In fact, he's the one who actually connects a lot of dots to the planning that was going on. So we know for sure that from Sitaram Baba's testimony that there was a grand plan at play. So, for example, one of the things that he mentions is that in the Maratha Mughal alliance, in the Marathas had reached out to pretty much all kings pan India, including the Raja of Brahmadesh. So Burma was included as part of the planning. South Indian kings were included as part of the planning. And then additionally, when Azimullah Khan had stopped by, when the Crimean War was being fought, he had stopped by and he had met with the Pasha in Turkey. And one of the theories that the British claim, we don't know, with more research needs to be done on that, is that the idea was that the Russians would help fight the British, because the Russians and Persia were on one side of the Crimean War, and the French, the British, other Europeans, and with support from the US were on the other side of the Crimean War. So given the two sides, one of the alliances was that the Russians would help stave off the British Navy, the Persians would help for infantry, but the goal was to take Delhi and maintain it. But unfortunately, Delhi fell in September of 1857. So that made it very difficult for the Persians to stick out their necks and to say that, okay, we're going to continue. And the same thing with the Russians. The Russians also were cautious in supporting. And my guess is that similar things happen in other parts of India, that once if we had, for example, if the British had not butchered Indian civilians, it terrorized the population. I can definitely say that losing your civilian population to British terror was not something that many kings were willing to do. So although there was a plan in place, you see some uprisings in Maharashtra, modern day Maharashtra. You see some in South India, some scattered here and there, and you see that Sitaram Baba was definitely in Bangalore carrying letters asking for support. So we knew there was a plan, but in terms of actual execution, There wasn't much, but again, I don't know much about that part of history.
Thank you, Paragji. Still, I'm sure you've given us a lot insight on that aspect of the South. So I'm going to, I know we are running short of time and there are many questions more coming into the group chat actually, but I'm going to conclude this with one question which is asked by Mr. Anup Shah, who has asked that how to make Indic narratives more mainstream.
I think our greatest strength has been to make mainstream the way I see, like decapitalizing history, make mainstream, decapitalize the M in mainstream. Is our strength is not in controlling the mainstream. Controlling the mainstream has always been people who aggregate power, whether it is aggregating religion, aggregating political control, aggregating media, like media with a capital M. So I would say our answers always lie in our strength, and our strength is in highly decentralized way of communication. Just what we are doing right now. Just do more of this. Just do inspire other people, get other people to join in. Peer-to-peer form of communication will always be the streams, rather than having a big stream that controls everything, rather than having one big government that controls everything, having one centralized religion that controls everything. Everything about our culture is about decentralization. So let's not worry about the mainstream. Let's focus on the multiple streams with a common thread that unite us, that there is something in our culture which wants to not just unite India as a nation but also the world. And that is empowering, and I think this is instinctively understood by most Indians. And let's marginalize the mainstream rather than worry about hijacking the mainstream.
Well, that was a fantastic, concluding message also in a way. And I don't know how, but it was to be one of the questions that I had to conclude with. Though, as I said, we can go on, and especially for all of those who actually are in love with history or who are passionate about history and really like to just go on and on hearing history, are going to say that this is the time was really less for giving and hearing such a presentation. I've started to also see a lot of comments which are appraising and appreciating your presentation, Paragji. Fantastic presentation and so on and on. Many compliments coming in also. But with this today that we are concluding, for all of them in the audience, I would like to say that opportunities are unlimited to stay connected, and you can log on to our website or connect us. And at the same time, every Saturday evening, we have these sessions. So we would like you to join in and stay tuned with us. Paragji, there are the feedback which is also come in, which is saying, of course, excellent presentation and that great insight by Mr. Parag Tope. To know more details, we are requesting everyone to actually log on to Amazon or look out for this book, The Operation Red Lotus. And I'm sure it's going to be a fantastic read. I would request all of you in the audience to please look out for this book. So,
yeah, thank you. And if people have any questions, they can reach out to me. They can get my contact information from you, Samiraji, either by email or by other forms. I'd be happy to engage with them if they have any questions going forward.
Sure. So thank you for your time. And on behalf of Bhavita Foundation, all of us here in India, and of course, I've had a lot of participants from across the globe also who have been registering for the event, and they have come across to hear you. So we have some guests who are from out of India also. From all of them, our heartfelt gratitude for you to give us your valuable time. And also, once again, a very happy Independence Day to each and every one of us out here. Thank you, Paragji. With this, I'd like to conclude the session now.